Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that might surprise you. When you picture a medieval castle, you probably imagine drafty stone halls, flickering torches, maybe a massive fireplace crackling somewhere in the distance. You imagine cold. You imagine discomfort. And you'd be mostly right. But here's the thing nobody talks about: medieval people didn't just suffer through winter. They survived it. And they survived it with methods that were equal parts clever, desperate, and surprisingly effective. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy this kind of content, and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket, ironically enough. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the cold stone walls of the medieval world, where staying warm wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The first thing you need to understand about medieval castles is that they were fundamentally terrible at retaining heat. These weren't cozy cottages. They were military fortifications, built with thick stone walls designed to stop arrows, battering rams, and invading armies. Nobody was thinking about thermal efficiency. Nobody cared if the bedchamber felt like the inside of a glacier in January. The priority was defense, not comfort. And that fundamental design problem shaped everything about how medieval people experienced winter. Stone is an exceptional building material for fortifications. It's strong, it's durable, it doesn't burn easily. But stone also has one deeply inconvenient property when it comes to living in a structure made entirely of it: stone retains cold brilliantly. During the day, thick castle walls would absorb whatever meager warmth the sun provided. Then, all night long, those same walls radiated that cold back into the interior spaces. Even if you managed to heat a room during the day, by morning, the stone had sucked all that warmth away and replaced it with a bone-deep chill that settled into your joints and refused to leave. High ceilings made the problem worse. Many castle halls had soaring vaulted ceilings, architecturally impressive and utterly disastrous for heat retention. Heat rises. Everyone knows this. In a castle great hall, heat rose enthusiastically toward the ceiling and stayed there, hovering uselessly 15 or 20 feet above the heads of the people trying to stay warm below. You could have a roaring fire blazing in the hearth, and 3 feet away from it, you'd still be shivering. And then there were the windows. Early medieval castles didn't have glass windows. They had narrow slits designed for archers to shoot through, and those slits let in wind, rain, snow, and cold without much obstruction. Later, when glass became available in the 13th century, it was wildly expensive and only the wealthiest households could afford it. Even when they could, glass didn't seal particularly well. Medieval window installations weren't airtight. Cold air seeped in constantly through gaps in the framing. For most castle inhabitants, windows were covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or thin sheets of treated animal skin. These helped a little, but drafts were relentless. Doorways didn't seal properly either. Heavy wooden doors swung on iron hinges, and gaps around the edges let cold air flow freely from room to room. Staircases acted like wind tunnels, pulling cold air up from lower levels and funneling it directly into bedchambers. Even the fireplaces, the primary source of heat, had chimneys that created a steady draft pulling cold air in from cracks and gaps throughout the building. Castles weren't just cold. They were actively working against any attempt to get warm. So how did people survive this? Let's start with the most obvious answer: fire. Fire was the backbone of medieval heating, and it came in several forms, each with its own advantages and serious drawbacks. The earliest method, and one that persisted in many households well into the later Middle Ages, was the central hearth. Picture a large fire pit located in the middle of the Great Hall, the main communal space where most daily life happened. This open fire provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Everyone would gather around it, drawn to the only source of warmth in the entire building. But central hearths had problems. Smoke, for one. Without a chimney, smoke from the fire would rise toward the ceiling and hopefully escape through a hole or vent in the roof. In practice, smoke filled the hall constantly. It hung in the air, stinging eyes, and coating everything in a layer of soot. Breathing was an experience. The smell of wood smoke became so ingrained in clothing, hair, and skin that it was simply the way people smelled. You didn't wash it off because you couldn't. Within hours, you'd smell like smoke again. Heat distribution from a central hearth was also wildly uneven. The people closest to the fire were warm, sometimes uncomfortably so. Their faces would flush, their clothing would dry out too quickly, sometimes even singe. Meanwhile, anyone more than a few feet away was still freezing. The edges of the Great Hall remained cold and drafty, no matter how large the fire burned. And at night, when the fire was allowed to die down for safety, the temperature plummeted. By morning, the hall would be nearly as cold as the outdoor air. The invention of the chimney changed everything, and it's one of those medieval innovations that doesn't get nearly enough credit. Chimneys began appearing in English castles around the late 12th century, with one of the earliest examples at Conisbrough Castle in Yorkshire, constructed around 1185. The concept was brilliantly simple: move the fireplace from the center of the room to the wall, and direct the smoke out through a vertical flue. This meant smoke no longer filled the room. It meant ceilings could be lower. It meant rooms could be smaller and therefore easier to heat. It meant you could have multiple fireplaces throughout a castle, each heating a specific chamber. The construction of these early fireplaces was no small feat. Castle walls were often several feet thick, and carving out space for a fireplace and chimney required careful planning. Masons had to build the flue at an angle, threading it through the stonework and ensuring it vented properly. Sometimes multiple flues from different floors would converge, all exhausting through a single chimney stack rising above the roofline. The fireplaces themselves were large enough in some cases that you could walk into them. These weren't decorative features. They were functional heating systems designed to burn massive logs and radiate warmth throughout a chamber. At Rochester Castle in Kent, you can still see 12th century fireplaces with ornate stone surrounds, proof that even functional objects were given artistic attention. These fireplaces heated not just the air but the stone itself. The thick masonry surrounding the fireplace would absorb heat during the day and slowly radiate it back into the room for hours after the fire died down. This thermal mass effect was crucial. It meant that even after the flames were out, the room retained some warmth well into the night. But fireplaces came with their own set of challenges. They required a constant supply of fuel, and in a castle, that meant wood. Lots of wood. Castles with extensive lands could manage forests and stockpile firewood, but even then, the sheer volume required was staggering. A single large fireplace could consume several armloads of wood in a day. Multiply that by however many fireplaces existed in the castle, and you're looking at a logistics operation. Someone had to cut the wood, transport it, split it, stack it, dry it, and carry it to wherever it was needed. In winter, when labor was already limited and conditions were harsh, this was exhausting work. And even with fireplaces, heat didn't spread. A fireplace warmed the room it was in. Walk into the next chamber, and you were back to freezing. Most castles didn't have fireplaces in every room. Only the most important spaces, the Great Hall, the Lord's Chamber, perhaps a guest room, warranted the expense and effort of installing one. Servants, soldiers, and lower-ranking household members made do with whatever residual warmth they could find. For spaces without fireplaces, or for providing supplemental heat, medieval castles used portable braziers. These were metal containers, usually bowl-shaped and set on legs, filled with burning coals or charcoal. Braziers could be moved from room to room as needed, carried by servants to wherever additional warmth was required. They were especially popular in bedchambers, where they'd be brought in before bedtime to take the edge off the cold. Braziers were convenient, but they were also dangerous. An open container of hot coals in a wooden-floored room filled with fabric hangings and dry rushes was essentially a fire waiting to happen. And it did happen. In 1698, a brazier being used to dry linen at Whitehall Palace in London caused a fire that burned down much of the palace. This wasn't an isolated incident. Braziers required constant supervision, careful placement, and a level of caution that wasn't always practiced. Then there were heated stones and bricks, a method that sounds almost comically primitive but was surprisingly effective. Stones or bricks would be heated in a fire until they were almost too hot to touch, then wrapped in cloth and placed wherever warmth was needed. Sometimes they'd be put into beds, tucked under blankets to warm the sheets before someone climbed in. Other times they'd be placed near seating areas or even held in hands like medieval hand warmers. The heat didn't last long, maybe an hour or two, but for that brief window, the warmth was real and deeply appreciated. Bed warmers, specifically designed for this purpose, were more sophisticated. These were long-handled pans, usually made of brass or copper, with hinged lids. Hot coals or ashes would be placed inside, and a servant would slide the bed warmer between the sheets, moving it around to warm the entire bed. Once the bed was warm, the bed warmer would be removed, and you'd climb in quickly before all that precious heat escaped. On the coldest nights, this made the difference between sleeping and lying awake shivering until dawn. But fire alone couldn't solve the heating problem. Medieval people understood this, and so they turned to other methods that involved working with the architecture, the materials, and even the living creatures around them. Insulation, in the modern sense, didn't exist. But medieval people understood the principle, even if they didn't have the materials we use today. They understood that trapping air created warmth and that blocking drafts made a room more livable. Heavy fabric hangings were essential. Tapestries, those large woven textiles often depicting hunting scenes, religious imagery, or heraldic symbols, weren't just decorative. They were functional insulation. Hung on stone walls, tapestries created a layer of air between the cold stone and the room's interior. This air gap reduced the amount of cold radiating inward. The thicker and heavier the fabric, the better it worked. Wealthy households invested in multiple tapestries, sometimes covering entire walls from floor to ceiling. Curtains served a similar purpose around beds. Four-poster beds with heavy curtains drawn on all sides created a small, enclosed space that could be warmed by body heat alone. Once you climbed inside and pulled the curtains shut, you were in your own little insulated chamber. The curtains blocked drafts, trapped warmth, and gave a sense of privacy in households where privacy was almost non-existent. On the coldest nights, sleeping inside a curtained bed could be several degrees warmer than sleeping exposed in the same room. These bed curtains were often made from expensive fabrics like velvet, wool, or brocade, and they were a significant investment. Some were embroidered with the owner's coat of arms or initials, turning a functional object into a status symbol. But even simpler versions made from heavy wool served the same purpose. The point wasn't luxury, it was survival. A curtained bed was the difference between waking up refreshed and waking up with frost in your hair. Floors were another problem area. Stone floors, like stone walls, retained cold and conducted it directly into your body if you stood on them too long. To combat this, medieval castles used floor coverings extensively. Rushes, essentially dried grasses and reeds, were strewn across floors in thick layers. These provided a small amount of insulation and made walking less unpleasant. Fresh rushes were mixed with herbs, lavender, rosemary, sweet-smelling plants that released their scent when crushed underfoot and helped mask the inevitable odors of a medieval household. Wealthier households used rugs or carpets, often imported and extremely valuable. These weren't decorative accessories. They were thermal barriers between cold stone and cold feet. Walking barefoot on stone in winter was unthinkable. Even with shoes, the cold seeped through leather soles. Rugs made movement around the castle marginally more comfortable, and in rooms where people sat for long periods, they were essential. Beyond architectural solutions, medieval people relied heavily on their clothing. This wasn't optional. If the castle was cold, and it was always cold, then clothing became your primary defense. And medieval clothing, especially winter clothing, was designed with survival in mind. Layering was the fundamental strategy. You didn't wear one thick garment. You wore multiple thinner garments, each trapping a layer of air that your body heat would warm. Starting with a linen undergarment against the skin, you'd add a wool tunic, then perhaps a woolen surcoat, then a cloak. Each layer contributed to warmth without restricting movement too much. Wool was the miracle fabric of the medieval world. Unlike linen or cotton, wool retains warmth even when damp. Wool fibers trap air, and air is an excellent insulator. Wool also naturally repels water to some degree, so rain or snow wouldn't immediately soak through. For medieval people living in cold, damp climates, wool was indispensable. Peasants wore coarse, undyed wool. The wealthy wore fine wool that had been fulled and dyed. But everyone, from the lowest servant to the highest noble, relied on wool to survive winter. Fur was reserved for the wealthy, but when available, it was unmatched for warmth. Rabbit, lamb, fox, marten, ermine, all were used to lined cloaks, hoods, and gloves. Fur-lined garments were heavy, expensive, and incredibly effective. The fur created an insulating layer that trapped body heat close to the skin, and on the coldest days, a fur-lined cloak could mean the difference between staying outside for hours or retreating indoors after minutes. Hoods were particularly important. A significant amount of body heat is lost through the head, and medieval people understood this instinctively. Hoods, often attached to cloaks, covered the head, neck, and sometimes the shoulders. When pulled up, they created a warm pocket around the face. The collar of the hood would catch rising body heat and keep it close, providing a small zone of warmth even when the rest of you was freezing. Some hoods had long tails, called liripipes, that could be wrapped around the neck for extra insulation. Gloves and mittens were essential for anyone working outdoors or handling cold objects. Leather gloves lined with wool or fur kept fingers functional when temperatures dropped. Mittens, with all fingers together instead of separated, were even warmer because shared warmth between fingers prevented them from going numb. Simple as they sound, these small garments allowed medieval people to continue working through conditions that would otherwise have been incapacitating. Footwear was another critical piece of the warmth puzzle. Leather boots, if you could afford them, protected feet from cold and wet ground. Socks made from wool helped, but they wore out quickly and had to be mended constantly. Some people stuffed their shoes with straw or extra cloth for insulation. On the coldest days, standing in one place too long was dangerous. Your feet would go numb, and frostbite was a real risk. Movement was necessary, not just to get tasks done, but to keep blood flowing and extremities warm. And then there was the human body itself, which generates heat constantly. Medieval people maximized this resource by sharing it. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed in medieval society. People lived, worked, and slept in close proximity, and during winter, this crowding became a survival mechanism. Families slept together in the same bed, not because they lacked space, but because shared body heat kept everyone warmer. Children slept between parents. Extended family members piled in if needed. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort, it was heat conservation. In great halls, servants and lower-ranking household members would sleep near the fire, huddled together in groups. The more bodies, the warmer the space. This communal sleeping arrangement wasn't romantic. It was practical. If you were lucky, you got a spot close to the fire. If not, you squeezed in next to someone else and hoped their body heat would be enough. And then there were the animals. This is the part of medieval heating strategy that sounds bizarre to modern sensibilities but made perfect sense at the time. Animals generate heat. A lot of it. A cow, a pig, a horse, any large mammal is essentially a living furnace, constantly burning calories and radiating warmth. Medieval peasants and some lower status castle residents understood this and took full advantage. In rural areas, it was common for houses to be built with animals on the ground floor and living quarters on the upper floor. The heat from the livestock below would rise, warming the floor of the living space above. This design, known as a house barn or longhouse, was widespread across northern Europe. It meant the family benefited from the animal's body heat without actually sharing the same room with them, though the smells and sounds certainly carried upward. In some cases, especially during the harshest cold, animals were brought directly into living spaces. Chickens, goats, pigs, even cows might be brought inside at night to prevent them from freezing and to contribute their warmth. This created a chaotic, smelly, noisy environment, but it worked. Every degree mattered. And if having a goat sleeping in the corner meant the difference between surviving the night or not, then the goat slept in the corner. Dogs were particularly valued for their warmth. They could lie next to people, curl up on laps, or sleep at the foot of a bed, providing localized heat exactly where it was needed. The phrase "three-dog night," referring to a night so cold you needed 3 dogs to keep warm, captures this medieval reality. Dogs weren't just companions or working animals. They were living heaters. Cats, though less commonly mentioned in medieval heating strategies, likely played a role as well. A cat curled up against you in bed provided warmth, and unlike dogs, cats were small enough to tuck into tight spaces where their heat could be concentrated. They also controlled rodent populations, which was crucial in buildings where stored grain was a precious winter resource. Food played a role in staying warm, though not in the way you might expect. Eating generates internal heat as your body metabolizes calories. Medieval people understood that staying warm required fuel, and that fuel was food. Hot meals were particularly important. Thick stews, porridge, roasted meats, anything that required chewing and digesting produced warmth from the inside out. Spiced wine, warmed near the fire and drunk before bed, helped warm the body and made sleep easier. But food was also scarce in winter, especially for lower classes. Stored grain, dried meats, root vegetables kept in cellars, these were the staples that had to last until spring. Eating more to stay warm meant depleting stores faster, which could lead to starvation before the next harvest. It was a constant balancing act. Stay warm now, or have enough food to survive until warmer weather returned. Monasteries had their own approaches to heating. Most monastic life was austere, with limited comfort and a strong emphasis on enduring hardship as a form of spiritual discipline. Monks often lived in unheated dormitories, slept on hard beds with minimal coverings, and endured cold that would have been intolerable for most lay people. But even monasteries recognized the need for some warmth. Many had a designated warming room, a single heated space where monks could go to thaw out during the coldest months. At Rievaulx Abbey in North Yorkshire, the warming house contained a large double fireplace that was kept burning from the 1st of November to Good Friday. This was the only heated room in the entire monastery. Monks would gather there between prayers and duties, standing as close to the fire as they dared, absorbing warmth before heading back out into the freezing cloisters and dormitories. It was a small concession to human frailty in an otherwise unrelenting environment. Interestingly, castles themselves varied widely in how cold they actually were. Geography mattered enormously. A castle in the warmer Mediterranean regions of southern France or Spain faced different challenges than one in Scotland or Scandinavia. Building materials mattered too. Some castles incorporated Roman techniques like hypocausts, underfloor heating systems where hot air from a furnace would circulate beneath the floor, warming the room above. These were rare and expensive, but where they existed, they made a dramatic difference. The Malbork Castle in Poland had an ingenious medieval heating system that used stone accumulation chambers. Wood would be burned in a furnace, and the heat would warm stones piled above the hearth. Dampers controlled airflow, ensuring efficient combustion. Once the wood was burned, the dampers closed, and the heat trapped in the stones would radiate slowly through channels into the rooms above. This system could maintain warmth for days after a single firing, using far less fuel than an open fire. It was efficient, sophisticated, and relatively rare. Most castles didn't have access to this level of engineering. What's striking about all of these methods, the fireplaces, the fabric hangings, the layered clothing, the shared body heat, is how much effort was required just to achieve a baseline level of survivability. Modern people think of being cold as an inconvenience. You turn up the thermostat, you put on a sweater, you complain about the weather. For medieval people, being cold was a constant, gnawing presence that shaped every decision, every activity, every moment of winter life. You didn't just wake up in a cold room. You woke up in a room where your breath formed clouds, where moisture had frozen on the inside of window shutters, where the water in the washing basin had a skim of ice on top. You dressed quickly, layering clothing while your fingers were still too numb to move easily. You hurried to wherever the fire was, knowing that warmth was temporary and localized. You ate near the fire. You worked near the fire. You lived your entire day in orbit around sources of heat, trying to absorb as much warmth as possible before you had to move on to the next task. At night, going to bed wasn't restful. It was strategic. You'd use a bed warmer if one was available. You'd pile on every blanket and fur you owned. You'd draw the bed curtains tight. You'd sleep in your clothes, or at least in a heavy nightshirt, because the idea of being naked in a medieval winter night was absurd. And even then, you'd wake up periodically, cold enough to pull blankets tighter, to shift position, to try to find a pocket of warmth that hadn't yet dissipated. Servants had it worse. If you were a low-ranking servant, you didn't get a curtained bed. You didn't get a spot near the fireplace. You got a rough blanket, maybe a cloak, and a spot on the floor wherever you could find one. You slept close to other servants, huddled together for warmth. You learned to fall asleep despite the cold because exhaustion left you no choice. And you woke up aching, stiff, and already dreading the long day ahead. Even nobles, with their fireplaces and their furs and their heated bedchambers, couldn't escape the cold entirely. They endured it better than others, certainly. But medieval comfort was still a far cry from modern comfort. The richest person in a castle was still waking up in a drafty stone room where the temperature hovered barely above freezing. They still had to dress in layers. They still spent their days near fires. They still went to bed cold and woke up colder. What's remarkable is the resilience this required. Medieval people didn't just tolerate the cold. They functioned in it. They worked, they socialized, they raised families, they celebrated, they mourned, all while living in conditions that would send most modern people running for the nearest heated building. They accepted cold as a fact of life, something to be managed but not eliminated. Winter was a season to be endured, and endure it they did. There's a tendency to romanticize the past, to imagine medieval castles as grand and magical places filled with feasts and chivalry. And in some ways, they were. But they were also cold. Bitterly, relentlessly cold. The stone walls that protected inhabitants from enemies also trapped the cold inside. The high ceilings that gave great halls their grandeur also made them impossible to heat. The narrow windows that kept arrows out also kept warmth from ever properly settling in. Medieval people survived winter through a combination of technology, resourcefulness, and sheer determination. They built fireplaces and chimneys. They hung heavy fabrics to block drafts. They layered wool and fur until movement was difficult but warmth was possible. They slept together, worked together, huddled around fires together. They brought animals inside, used heated stones, drank warm spiced wine, and ate hot meals whenever they could. And when all of that wasn't enough, they endured. They woke up cold, they went to bed cold, and they accepted that this was simply how winter was. There was no complaining that would change it. There was no magic solution that would make the castle warm. There was only the fire, the layers, the shared body heat, and the knowledge that spring would eventually come. If you've enjoyed tonight's dive into the unglamorous realities of medieval heating, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the parts of history that textbooks skip over. And drop a comment letting me know what aspect of medieval life you'd like to explore next. Until next time, stay warm out there, and be grateful for your thermostat.